They're creepy and true horror stories from the Dixie National Forest that still haunt Utah. Dixie National Forest has a strange way of changing its identity depending on the person who enters it. At sunrise, it looks harmless. The red cliffs glow with a warm color that feels almost comforting, and the long stretches of pines sway gently as if they are welcoming anyone passing through. Roads cut clean paths between open meadows and shadowed valleys, and the sky above looks endless. For most travelers, it is the kind of landscape that makes them roll the windows down and breathe in the sharp scent of pine. They think they are driving into a peaceful piece of wilderness, a postcard version of Utah's untouched beauty. That is the impression most people get, because they never stay long enough to feel anything different. But if you talk to the people who work in those woods, or the few hikers who have spent nights deep inside the backcountry, you hear a completely different version of the forest. They talk about a heaviness in the air that settles the moment you step away from the paved road. They talk about a silence that has weight, a silence that feels controlled, like the forest is listening more than it is resting. Some describe the sensation of being watched from tree lines where nothing seems to move. Others mention the faint smell of something metallic, drifting between the trees when the temperature drops suddenly. None of these descriptions make sense when you hear them out of context, but the people who say them are not the type to exaggerate. Most of them avoid the dramatic version of events because they do not want to sound unbalanced. Yet they struggle to hide the way their voice changes when they talk about certain areas of the forest. Ask a ranger, and they'll tell you about calls they respond to that never make it into the official reports. A campsite torn apart from the inside while the fire was still warm. A trail of footprints that end abruptly at a cluster of trees with no logical exit. A hiker who claims he saw someone standing between the pines, watching him without moving, only for the figure to disappear the moment he tried to call out. Some of these rangers have worked search and rescue for years. They know how quickly panic can distort a memory. They know how to separate fear from fact, but every once in a while, they encounter something that does not fit the pattern, something they cannot file or explain. Those are the nights they remember. Locals have their own warnings. They do not present them as ghost stories or legends meant to entertain tourists. They speak carefully, choosing their words in a way that suggests they have decided it is better to give a small warning than to stay silent. Some say not to camp near abandoned cabins, especially the ones with locked cellars half sunk into the ground. Others say there are parts of the forest where animals avoid walking, and if you find yourself in one of those places by accident, you should leave immediately without stopping to question why. A few talk about hearing thin, distant sounds that travel in a straight line through the trees, sounds that do not echo or fade naturally. They claim these sounds feel directed, like they are meant for the person who hears them. Of course, outsiders brush these stories off. They think Utah locals are just being dramatic or superstitious. They drive through the forest, take their pictures, and move on with their vacations. They never hear the parts that are spoken only when the sun is down and the kitchen lights are low. They never hear how some residents refuse to step outside at night without checking the tree line first. They never hear about the families who lock their doors long before dusk, even though they live miles away from the nearest neighbor. If you ask them why, they struggle to explain. They say the woods look different at night. They say the shadows feel too still. They say there are things you notice only when the moonlight hits the ground just right. The truth is that Dixie National Forest keeps its secrets. It is the kind of place that looks beautiful until you stop and really pay attention to the details. Then you notice how quickly the temperature changes between one ridge and the next. You notice how some parts of the forest never seem to have birds, even when the rest of the area is full of them. You notice how small sounds seem too close, as if they come from the wrong direction. You notice how the darkness feels layered, not a single sheet, but several depths of shadow stacked on top of each other. The first story you are about to hear comes from someone who spent years working inside that forest. Someone trained to observe, to remain calm, to recognize threats before they become disasters. Someone who did not believe anything strange could happen out there until the night it finally did. And what he encountered still troubles him today. He worked search and rescue in Dixie National Forest for almost 8 years. His name is withheld for privacy, but he agreed to share the incident under one condition: no embellishments, no dramatic twists, nothing added to make the story sound supernatural. He insisted that the events alone were disturbing enough. According to him, the call came during the second week of October, a time when the forest shifts into a colder, sharper version of itself. Days are warm, but the nights cut fast, and the air picks up that dry scent of pine bark mixed with freezing soil. That evening, the sun had already fallen behind the ridgeline, leaving just enough fading light to outline the tops of the trees in a thin strip of orange. It was the time of day when the forest becomes quiet in a way that feels intentional. Dispatch reported a missing hiker near the TR Creek area, a section of the forest known for twisting paths and steep drops hidden by heavy brush. Most hikers stay on the marked routes, but this one had taken a detour after spotting what he believed was an old mining trail. He was supposed to return to his campsite before dark, but 2 hours passed without any sign of movement. His brother called for help after finding the man's pack on the ground near a fallen tree. The pack was zipped, untouched, and placed neatly against the trunk as if someone had set it down while planning to come back. That detail alone was unusual. People in distress rarely leave their gear behind, especially water. The missing hiker had left everything except a flashlight. The ranger arrived at the trailhead just after dusk. The temperature had dropped so quickly that his breath was visible. He checked his radio, ran through the usual safety procedures, and started down the path with a high beam that cut a sharp white tunnel through the dark. The forest around him felt muted. Even the crunch of the ground under his boots sounded strangely soft, like the soil was absorbing the noise faster than normal. He moved slowly, listening for branches breaking or any sign of a person calling out. Instead, he heard only the faint rustle of wind sliding through trees. He reached the spot where the pack was found. It sat exactly as the brother described it, upright, clean, untouched by animals. That bothered him more than anything else. Packs left out in the open usually show signs of disturbance. This one looked as if it had been carefully placed and left alone by everything around it. He swept his flashlight across the ground and noticed tracks leading away from the area, but they were strange. They were deep at first, clear imprints of hiking boots, but after 12 or 13 steps the impressions became shallow, as if the person had started walking lighter. Then the tracks thinned out so much they barely pressed the soil before disappearing completely near a cluster of thick pines. He moved closer, expecting to pick up the trail again on the other side, but the ground was smooth. No disturbed leaves, no broken twigs, no sign of movement in any direction. He crouched down and ran his hand across the dirt. It felt cold, colder than the surrounding area, as if the ground in that one spot held the temperature of a much darker place. He stood up and scanned the tree line. The air had turned still. The forest felt like it was waiting for him to make a decision. That was the moment he felt it, the subtle shift that told him he was no longer alone. A pressure settled behind him, not a sound exactly, but the unmistakable awareness of being watched. He turned slowly, expecting to see a deer or maybe the missing hiker, approaching quietly in shock or confusion. Instead, the beam of his flashlight hit only trees. Tall, still, perfectly aligned trees. But something about the pattern felt off. He could not explain it later, but he said the spacing between the trunks looked wrong, as if one of the shapes had shifted position between the time he arrived and the time he turned around. He called out the hiker's name, projecting his voice with confidence, letting it travel straight between the trees. The response he expected never came. The forest swallowed the sound faster than it should have. Even an echo refused to come back to him. He tried again, louder this time, and again the forest gave nothing. The quiet had weight. It felt like stepping into a room where an argument had just happened, and everyone was pretending nothing was wrong. He raised his radio to update dispatch, but something in the back of his mind told him to wait. The forest around him felt too still. He took a single step toward the cluster of trees where the tracks ended, and his foot landed on soil that felt unnaturally soft. That was when his pulse tightened. Instinct told him to stop advancing. He listened again, searching for any sign of movement. There was none, but he felt the pressure again, stronger this time, settling between his shoulder blades like a warning. He knew then that the situation was about to shift into something he had not trained for. He took a slow breath and stepped back from the softened patch of soil, letting his instincts settle before he pushed forward again. Years in the field had taught him that the first strange sign often appears as something small, something a less experienced person would overlook. But the woods were too quiet, and the tracks ending so abruptly had already set off alarms in his head. He swept his flashlight in a steady arc, letting the beam cut across branches, shrubs, and the narrow gaps between tree trunks. The light revealed nothing out of place, yet the feeling that someone stood just beyond its reach would not leave him. He crouched again, this time running his hand along a fallen branch near the spot where the tracks vanished. The wood felt cold, far colder than it should have been considering the temperature. It felt almost damp, like it had been pulled from a stream, but when he checked his fingers, they were dry. There was no moisture, no dew, nothing that could explain it. He lifted the branch, turned it slightly, and caught a faint smell rising from the bark. It reminded him of old copper mixed with something sour. He set the branch down slowly, feeling the air shift against his ears as if the forest had exhaled. He called out again, softer this time, not wanting his voice to punch a hole in the silence. The moment he spoke, something answered, though not in a way that made sense. It was not a voice or an animal sound, it was more like a brief vibration in the air, a low tremor that he felt rather than heard. It pulsed once, short and controlled, and then the forest returned to silence. His first thought was that he had stepped near a hollowed log or a pocket of unstable ground, but nothing around him suggested that. The sensation had come from the trees ahead, almost as if the trunks themselves had tightened and relaxed inside the bark. He raised his flashlight again and focused on a specific area between two pines. Something faint reflected back at him. Not eyes, not metal, not anything identifiable. It was more like a slight shimmer, a brief flicker of movement that disappeared the second he adjusted his angle. He narrowed his eyes and held the beam steady. The space remained empty. He waited, searching the shadows for another shift, but nothing moved. That brief flicker had been real, and it had come from the exact direction where the tracks ended. The ranger felt a chill spread across his back, not the kind caused by cold wind, but the type that rises from instinctive recognition. Something about that shimmer did not belong in a forest. It reminded him of the way heat distorts pavement on hot days, a soft ripple of air that bends light. Except the temperature around him was freezing, and the air was still. The environment made no sense. He adjusted his stance, keeping his weight distributed, ready to react if something stepped toward him. When he took another step back, the crunch beneath his boots sounded delayed, as if the ground responded a fraction of a second after his foot touched it. The sound lagged behind the movement. He froze, lowering the flashlight toward the soil to check if he had stepped on something unusual. The earth looked normal, packed and undisturbed. Yet when he moved again, he felt the same lag, like the forest was out of sync with his actions. He tried shifting his weight from one foot to the other, testing the sensation, and the delay remained. The forest seemed to be slowing around him. He whispered the hiker's name again, steady and calm, trying to anchor himself with something familiar. The response was immediate but not natural. The air to his left shifted with a thin rustling sound. It came from high among the branches, too high for a human to be moving. The rustling repeated once, then stopped abruptly, replaced by a short, sharp snap of something under pressure. The ranger turned his beam upward, catching only the swaying of a few branches, but the movement did not match the rhythm of the wind. It looked controlled. He held his light steady, watching as one of the branches trembled slightly. The motion was subtle and deliberate, not the random shake of foliage reacting to airflow. It looked like something had touched the branch and withdrawn quickly. A second later, another branch on the opposite side moved in the same subtle pattern. The ranger stepped back again, this time more carefully, realizing the branches were shifting in a sequence, not at random. They were reacting to something passing between them, though whatever it was left no visible shape. He tried to radio in the observation, but stopped halfway through pressing the button. The forest around him tightened again, not physically but perceptually, like the darkness was pulling in from all sides. That was when he realized something else, something that made his heart kick harder. The cold spot on the ground where the tracks had disappeared was no longer colder than the surroundings. The temperature had leveled out. Whatever had been there had moved. He raised the flashlight higher, scanning the tree line in a deliberate pattern. The space between the trunks warped subtly at the far edge of the beam, not enough to reveal a shape, but enough to show a distortion in the air. It looked like a thin slice of the darkness was bending inward. When he stepped toward it, the distortion blinked out completely. He knew then that the first strange sign was not the missing tracks, not the cold soil, and not even the shifting branches. The first strange sign was the forest reacting to something he could not see, as if the woods themselves were adjusting to accommodate a presence that did not belong. He steadied his breathing and lowered his center of gravity. Years of training told him not to rush forward when the environment began acting in ways that defied pattern. He kept the flashlight raised, sweeping slowly from left to right, giving his eyes time to adjust to every layer of darkness. The distortion he'd seen earlier did not return, yet the forest felt tighter, as if something inside it had begun to shift positions with calculated intent. He began to circle the last known spot of the hiker's tracks, careful to avoid stepping on anything that might compromise evidence. Even then, the ground felt unnatural. With every step he took, he sensed the faintest tremor under the soil, a vibration so weak he questioned if it was real. He stopped and knelt again, placing his hand flat on the ground. The soil seemed to breathe. A mild pulse rose and fell beneath his palm, steady and slow, like the faint rhythm of something alive. He lifted his hand and wiped it against his jacket. His fingers were not cold. They were numb. The effect crept up his arm like a soft current, and he pulled away quickly, shaking his hand until the feeling returned. He scanned the forest again, this time allowing the beam to linger on each tree, searching for any irregularities in the bark or branches. The smell of copper returned, stronger now, drifting from deeper inside the woods. It was a heavy scent, dense enough that he caught it even through the cold night air. He fought the natural instinct to step back and instead directed the flashlight into the direction where the scent was thickest. The light hit nothing but trees and undergrowth, yet the smell sharpened, becoming metallic. He felt it in his throat, thin and bitter. He tightened his grip on the radio, wanting to signal the update, but the static from earlier made him hesitate. A sound pealed through the silence. It was soft, thin and distant at first, like a single note plucked from a wire under tension. It repeated once, then again, each time growing sharper, more focused. He raised the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only reached a few yards before dissolving into the dark. The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by something much worse, a low scraping, like bark being peeled from a tree. It traveled from one trunk to another, moving in a line parallel to his position, as though circling him with precision. He turned in place, scanning every direction, but the scraping always stayed just outside his line of sight. It traveled fast, jumping from one point to another. His instinct screamed that whatever was making that sound was not moving on the ground. It was traveling between the trees, gliding or climbing with unnatural speed. He positioned his back toward the area with the clearest escape route, keeping the flashlight in front of him as he slowly stepped away from the cluster of pines. The forest shifted in tone. The silence stopped feeling passive. It felt heavy now, pressing down from the canopy. He could hear his own breathing, sharp against the cold. He reached for his radio again, intending to call for backup, but the moment he pressed the button, a new sound rose from the woods. It was closer this time, a soft tapping against wood, a measured rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. Each hit landed with deliberate pressure, as if testing his reaction. He aimed the beam toward the tapping and caught a fragment of movement. A thin shadow slipped down the side of a tree, fast and smooth, vanishing behind the trunk before he could lock onto it. He advanced the light along the bark. There was nothing there, no animal, no hiker, no figure. But the tapping continued, shifting positions with disquieting speed. It no longer sounded like one source. It echoed from two sides, then three. His pulse spiked. He turned slowly in place, realizing he had allowed the forest to tighten around him. Shadows stretched between the trees in unnatural symmetry. The air felt charged, as if static electricity clung to the bark. He took a calculated step backward. The tapping stopped instantly, replaced by a single sound that reached him with absolute clarity. A breath, not the wind. Not an animal, a breath just beyond the reach of his flashlight. He held the beam steady, bringing it up slightly, and felt the sensation of eyes tracking him from the dark. He could not see them, but the weight of the gaze was unmistakable. It moved with him, matching his slow retreat. He could feel it shifting, adjusting, analyzing him. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. That was when he saw it. Not a figure, not a face. A shape between the trunks, barely visible. It leaned subtly to one side, as if studying him with silent interest. He blinked once, and the shape straightened. He blinked again, and it was gone. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and took another step backward, legs tense, ready to run if necessary. The forest responded with a single soft crack in the distance, like a branch being snapped under weight. Something was moving, and now it had changed direction. He was not looking for the hiker anymore. The forest had shifted the purpose of his search. The ranger tightened his stance, forcing himself not to turn his back on the direction of the sound. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to leave, to break into a full sprint toward the trailhead. But years of training kept him anchored long enough to evaluate what was happening. He shifted the flashlight again, sweeping through the gaps between the trees. The branches were too still. The forest felt staged, as if something had arranged the silence to control his next move. He listened for a second crack, but the woods offered nothing. That brief fracture of sound had been intentional. He felt certain of it. He stepped backward again, keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line. The forest responded with a faint thump, distant but directed. It came from the left, measured and steady, then another, and another. The thumps grew louder, not by much, but enough that he could tell they were closing in. They did not sound like footsteps. They sounded heavier, almost as if something was dropping its weight onto the ground at intervals. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught nothing except endless trunks stretching into the dark. A sudden burst of cold touched his face, sharp and targeted, as if a blast of winter air had surged from a narrow opening. He staggered back, raising the flashlight instinctively. His breath steamed in front of him in a way that struck him as wrong. The temperature around him had plummeted, but only in a tight circle. He moved his hand outside the beam of light and felt normal cold. He moved it back into the beam, and the temperature dropped again. He lowered the flashlight a few inches, and the cold intensified. Something was affecting the air where the light passed. He swept the beam across the trees again, slower this time, controlling his breath so he could hear every shift around him. When the light passed the base of the nearest pine, he saw it. A single mark carved into the bark. A straight vertical line, fresh, clean. Too smooth for an animal to have made it. He stepped closer and saw a second mark beside it, slightly diagonal, then a third, forming a rough shape that made no sense. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a symbol he recognized. It looked more like the beginning of a pattern, as if someone had started carving something but stopped abruptly. He reached out with his free hand, inches from the bark. But before he touched it, a deep creaking sound rose from behind him. It was not the bending of a tree in the wind. It was low and slow, like a heavy structure shifting under its own weight. He spun, flashlight raised, and the beam caught movement. Not a full figure, not a body, just the faintest distortion of the darkness pulling back behind a trunk, retreating with unnatural speed. He felt the forest close around him. The tapping from earlier returned, but softer now, as if coming from inside the trees rather than on their surface. The sound multiplied, clicking in rapid sequences, almost like communication. He backed up with sharper movements, no longer hiding his urgency. His breath matched the pace of his heartbeat, short and tight. A new sound erupted to his right. Branches snapped under weight. Real weight. He turned the flashlight, but the beam caught only the aftermath of movement. Branches still swaying from whatever had just passed through them. He stepped back again, boots sliding slightly on the soft ground. His foot hit something behind him. He turned the beam downward and froze. A boot print. A human boot print. Fresh. It pointed in the direction he had just come from, not toward the deeper woods. Someone had passed behind him while he had been focused on the other direction. He scanned the ground, and more prints appeared. 2, 3, 4, each one spaced unevenly, as if the person had been moving fast or stumbling. He swept the light further and saw a fifth print, but this one was twisted at an odd angle, almost sideways, as if the foot attached to it hadn't been placed naturally. He followed the prints with the light and felt his chest tighten. The last print wasn't a print at all. It was a slide mark, as if the person had been pulled rapidly, feet dragging through the soil. The mark ended abruptly at the base of a thick tree. There were no prints on the other side, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no drops of blood, nothing. He raised his flashlight higher, letting it fill the space between the branches. Something was up there. He could feel it watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight, reacting to a presence he could not see. He slowly moved the beam upward, careful not to jerk the light. Halfway up the trunk, the beam caught something that made him step back so hard he nearly fell. A handprint pressed into the bark, not on the surface, into it. The wood was indented as if something had gripped the tree with inhuman pressure. The shape was wrong, too long in the fingers, too narrow in the palm, and angled in a way no human wrist could achieve. He stared at the mark, trying to force logic into what he was seeing. Before he could move, another branch snapped behind him, closer. He turned, light shaking slightly, and saw the distortion again. This time it held still for a fraction of a second before slipping away. The forest was done observing him. It was repositioning. He realized staying any longer was no longer safe. The forest had shifted from quiet to strategic. Whatever had been circling him was no longer testing him. It was repositioning with purpose, and the ranger knew he was now at risk of becoming a second missing person. He tightened the strap of his flashlight, backed up slowly, and kept his radio ready, even though he doubted it would work. The cold around him deepened, not in temperature alone, but in pressure, like the air itself had thickened. His breath felt heavier moving through it. The ground beneath his boots vibrated again, stronger than before, and he felt the faint tremor climb up his legs. It wasn't caused by machinery or distant thunder. It felt rhythmic, as if responding to his movement. He tried to stay calm, controlling each breath, but the forest now responded to him with its own pulse, rising and falling in an unnerving pattern. He stepped back again, and the vibration halted instantly. He froze. The forest froze with him. He slowly raised the flashlight to check the branches overhead. The distortion returned, hanging between two trunks. A shape existed there, but not one he could describe. It wasn't solid. It wasn't smoke. It was more like the space itself had changed density, bending the light around it in a way that made his eyes strain. He tried focusing on it, but the harder he stared, the more the shape seemed to sink into the darkness, peeling itself backward, as if slipping through a thin gap between the trees. That was when the sound returned. A breath, close enough that it reached him with unmistakable clarity. He turned the flashlight toward the source, but the beam weakened, dimming for a split second before restoring itself. He adjusted his grip, knuckles whitening, and called out one last time for the missing hiker. This time, the forest answered with a sound he had never heard in his life. It was low and resonant, vibrating inside the trunks and pushing through the ground. It carried weight, a presence. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a voice. It was something in between. His body reacted before his brain did. He stepped back, then another step faster each time until he was moving at a steady retreat. The forest followed. He felt it. The pressure shifted behind him with each backward step, matching his rhythm. Branches moved not with wind, but with contact. Whatever had been observing him had come down from the trees. He turned and began walking quickly toward the trail, avoiding a full sprint only because he knew running blindly in darkness could get him killed. The flashlight flickered once, then again. The cold behind him increased. He heard another breath, closer, then another to his left. Something was pacing him. He raised the radio, finally committing to calling for backup, but when he pressed the button, only static poured through. Not normal static. It had rhythm. It pulsed in short, sharp bursts that sounded intentional. He shut it off and focused on the path ahead. The trees began to thin. He recognized a formation of rocks near the bend, leading back to the main trail. He pushed forward, forcing his legs to keep moving even though his lungs tightened with every step. As he approached the clearing, the vibrations stopped. The tapping ceased. The cold lifted. The forest went dead still. He didn't turn around. He walked faster, reached the main trail, and finally allowed himself to break into a run. The moment his boots hit the gravel near the trailhead, the radio snapped back to life with a burst of normal static. Dispatch asked for an update. He didn't answer right away. He bent over, breathing hard, throat burning with cold air. Behind him, the tree line stood quiet, too quiet, as if the forest were absorbing the last traces of movement. When he finally responded, he requested additional teams with the strongest voice he could manage, but he gave no details. He knew how this would sound. He knew what he hadn't seen clearly, and he knew what he had felt. His report focused on the missing hiker, nothing more. The team searched for 2 days before finding something. They discovered the man's flashlight wedged between 2 thick branches 10 feet above the ground. The glass was cracked outward. The batteries were missing. There were no footprints below. The hiker was never found. Weeks later, the ranger returned to the site during the daytime, hoping sunlight would change the way the forest felt. It didn't. The air remained cold in the exact spot where the tracks had vanished. The vibrations returned when he placed his hand on the ground, and the carved marks he had seen on the tree had faded, not worn away, but faded, as if the bark had healed over them far too fast. He never went back after that visit. He transferred to a different region of Utah and refused assignments anywhere near Dixie National Forest. When asked why, he only said the forest was wrong in ways he could not explain, and that some things in those woods were better left alone. He believes the hiker did not simply get lost. He believes something else found him first. And when asked what he thinks moved through the trees that night, he gives the same answer every time. He doesn't know. He also doesn't want to. What happened to that ranger was never classified as anything other than an unresolved missing person case, but everyone who worked with him noticed the change. Before that night, he was calm, steady, the type of person who could walk into a snowstorm or a canyon rescue with complete focus. After that night, he avoided the woods whenever he could. He stopped doing solo patrols entirely. He told his closest co-worker that the forest had shifted on him, and although he refused to explain what that meant, the look in his eyes was enough to silence any questions. People who work in remote areas learn to recognize when someone has been pushed beyond their ability to rationalize what they encountered. He had crossed that line, and the strange part is that his experience wasn't an isolated one. Over the years, scattered reports from different corners of Dixie National Forest carried the same quiet tension. Hikers disappearing without any clear trail to follow, campers waking up to find their tents unzipped from the outside, hunters claiming that something stalked them but never showed itself, road workers hearing sounds coming from tree lines where no one stood. The stories never matched in detail, but they all shared the same undercurrent, a sense that something inside the forest moved with purpose only when people were alone. The ranger's case haunted the staff for months, not because of the missing man, although that weighed heavily on everyone, but because the ranger who searched for him refused to describe what he saw. When someone who knows the terrain refuses to put their experience into words, it creates a different kind of fear. A fear based not on imagination, but on omission. After he left the region, his co-workers quietly agreed not to bring up the incident again. They never said the forest was dangerous, but they avoided certain trails at night and discouraged tourists from exploring unmarked paths. They didn't claim anything supernatural. They just acted like people who had learned a lesson the hard way. But while the ranger's story was steeped in silence, the next one was different. This one didn't come from someone trained to stay calm under pressure. It came from a man who made his living maintaining remote access roads and service routes near the southern end of the forest. He wasn't a hiker or a ranger or an avid outdoorsman. He was just doing his job when he stumbled into something that changed him in ways he never expected. His account surfaced only once, in a late-night interview recorded by a friend who said he had never seen the man so shaken. According to him, the encounter didn't happen deep in the woods. It didn't happen near a trail or a campground or a hidden valley. It happened on a stretch of road where nothing unusual had ever been reported. A place so ordinary that most people barely notice it while passing through. And that's what made his story so unnerving. There was no reason for anything strange to happen there. No history, no warnings, no local rumors. Just a simple deserted road cutting through a quiet section of Dixie National Forest. Yet something happened that night. Something he still can't describe without losing his composure. Something he said followed him long after he escaped the forest, as if whatever he saw wasn't bound to the trees or the darkness, as if it had learned him. And his story begins with a single detail he repeated more than once. A detail he said should never occur on a road that remote. A detail that marked the exact moment he realized he was not alone out there. He had been working road maintenance crews for almost 15 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of remote stretches better than most people who passed through them. His job wasn't complicated. Inspect the gravel shoulders, clear fallen branches, check for erosion after storms, and make sure service vehicles could pass without trouble. It was steady work, predictable, the kind of routine that lets a person settle into a quiet pace. He never had a reason to feel uneasy out there. The southern edge of Dixie National Forest was calm, a place where the only real dangers came from sudden weather shifts or wildlife wandering into the road. Nothing in his years on the job had prepared him for what he encountered that night. It was early November, a week after the first thin layer of frost had started collecting in the mornings. The sun had dropped behind the ridge earlier than usual, leaving the sky a pale grey that darkened fast. He had been finishing the last segment of his shift, checking a short bend of road where erosion from summer rains sometimes created shallow dips in the asphalt. He expected to be done within 10 minutes. The forest around him seemed still, the kind of stillness that made the engine of his truck sound louder than normal. He stepped out, grabbing his work lantern and a small toolkit, and started walking along the curve to inspect the ground. The air had a clean, cold edge to it, sharp enough that he could taste the dryness. He liked nights like this. Quiet, simple, no tourists, no passing cars, just the dark ribbon of road cutting through the forest. He felt comfortable there, surrounded by tall pines and the faint scent of sap rising from the cold ground. He'd done this exact task hundreds of times without a second thought. But that night, something small shifted in the atmosphere. A tiny change, subtle enough that he only noticed it because he'd spent years learning the natural patterns of the place. It was the sound, or rather the lack of it. Forests at night aren't silent. There are insects, distant owls, rustling leaves, the faint creak of branches reacting to temperature changes. Even when it seems quiet, there's always a background layer of life moving in the dark. But suddenly everything around him muted. The air seemed to absorb the sound before it reached his ears. His footsteps on the pavement sounded too soft, almost cushioned. When he stopped walking, he expected to hear at least a faint whisper of wind moving through the treetops. There was nothing. He lifted the lantern slightly, adjusting the light so it cast a wide glow across the bend. The trees on both sides looked normal, straight trunks and thick branches. The forest didn't look threatening, it just looked empty, completely empty. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that cold nights often made the woods quiet. He crouched down to inspect a shallow crack forming at the edge of the road and made a mental note to log it the next morning. When he stood up again, the silence felt even heavier. He took a few steps back toward his truck, intending to grab the measuring wheel he'd left in the passenger seat. That was when he noticed the first detail. His truck's headlights were still on, illuminating the road in front of it. But the beam didn't look right. The light was too narrow, the edges were too sharp. Headlight beams naturally diffuse into the environment, softening as they stretch into the dark. But his headlights seemed to cut the road in a perfect cone, with no glow, no fading, no scattering of light particles. It was like the darkness around the road had thickened, refusing to allow the light to spread. He frowned and took another step toward the truck. The headlights didn't change. The road remained sharply divided between light and dark, like a stage set under a single spotlight. He paused, lantern raised, watching the beam of his truck's lights for any flicker. The beam was steady, unnaturally steady. That was the exact moment he felt the first ripple of unease move through his chest. He wasn't a man who spooked easily, but something about those headlights triggered something instinctive, a pressure that settled low in his ribs. He called out once, more to himself than to anyone else, just to hear the sound of his own voice break the silence. The sound carried only a short distance before fading abruptly, as if the night air swallowed it. He took another step toward the truck, trying to brush the anxiety aside. But his body reacted before his mind found an explanation. The hair on his arms lifted. The skin on the back of his neck tightened. The quiet around him wasn't natural. It was deliberate. Then he saw the next detail, something far more unsettling. His truck was still running, but the exhaust wasn't rising. No vapor, no movement. The cold air should have made the exhaust visible, drifting upward in slow trails, but nothing moved behind the vehicle. It looked frozen, as if the air around the truck had stopped functioning the way it should. That was the moment he realized he wasn't alone on that road. He stood completely still, lantern raised, waiting for his mind to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The truck idling in the middle of a deserted forest road should have produced at least a faint stream of vapor in that cold air, but the space behind it remained empty. The darkness hovering around the back of the truck looked unnaturally flat, as if the exhaust pipe were pushing air into a void rather than into the night. He took one slow step toward the vehicle, then another, listening for any mechanical change in the engine. It hummed at the same steady pace. Nothing sputtered, nothing flickered. The road felt suspended in time. He moved until he was 10 feet behind the truck. The air near the tailgate felt wrong. There was no cold puff hitting his cheeks, no subtle vibration in the air from the engine's cycle. He crouched slightly and extended his hand behind the exhaust pipe. He expected warmth. Instead, he felt nothing, no heat, no movement. The air resisted his hand, thick and unmoving, like pushing into a pocket where the atmosphere refused to circulate. He pulled his hand back quickly, rubbing his palm against his jacket to shake off the strange sensation. The quiet around him deepened. He took a cautious step back, lantern raised again, scanning the tree line. The pines stood silent, their silhouettes sharp and unmoving under the faint glow of the lantern. Normally, light would scatter through the branches, revealing depth and texture, but the lantern's glow seemed to fall short, as if it were being absorbed before reaching the treetops. His eyes searched for movement, an animal, a shifting shadow, anything that could explain the strange stillness. The forest remained as empty and frozen as the air behind his truck. His gaze drifted downward, and a chill ran through him. At the edge of the road, near the gravel shoulder, he saw something that didn't belong. A single footprint, not large, not distorted, just a normal human footprint pressed into the frost, pointing toward the forest. He moved closer, crouching to examine it. The shape was clear, sharp at the edges, almost too clean, as if it had been placed there moments before he turned around. He leaned closer, looking for others, expecting a trail leading away from the road. There were none. Not one before it, not one after it. A single print, isolated in the frost. He straightened slowly, every muscle tightening in his shoulders. The print hadn't been there when he arrived. He was certain he would have stepped directly on it. The realization pressed into him with sudden weight. Someone else was out there, someone moving close enough to leave a perfect imprint in the frost without making a sound. He raised the lantern higher, casting its glow across the gravel. The edges of the footprint glistened under the light. It was fresh. A faint crack echoed from the woods, a small, brittle sound, like a dry twig snapping under pressure. He turned immediately, lantern aimed into the trees, but the sound didn't repeat. He tried to place the direction, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trunks and dissolving before he could locate it. He held his breath, straining to hear anything else. Silence swallowed the forest again. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but his voice felt muted, cut short by the dense air around him. It didn't echo the way it should have. He stepped closer to the trees, trying to see past the first line of trunks. The darkness between them looked thicker than the night sky, as if something had soaked up the last traces of light. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, and noticed a faint shimmer. Not movement exactly, more like a distortion in the air, a bending of light that rippled for half a second and then vanished. He blinked hard, unsure if he had imagined it, but the feeling that followed was real. The sensation of being watched crept across the back of his neck, tightening the skin. He turned to look behind him. His truck sat silently, headlights still frozen in those unnaturally sharp beams. For a moment he felt like stepping into the cab and leaving everything behind, but curiosity held him still. It wasn't bravery. It was the need to understand what was happening around him. He turned back toward the trees, raising the lantern again. His hand shook slightly, enough that the beam trembled over the forest floor. He took a slow step forward, then another, listening for another crack or shift of movement. Instead, something else happened. The lantern dimmed. Not all at once, but gradually, as if the darkness were pulling the light into itself. He shook the lantern gently, thinking it might be failing, but the bulb was fine. The light simply couldn't push deeper into the forest. He backed away from the trees, letting instinct control his movements. The lantern brightened again the moment he stepped back onto the road. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the line where the asphalt met the gravel. Something was wrong in the woods. Something was controlling the space around him, and he had no idea how close it had already gotten. He backed away from the tree line, keeping the lantern raised as he returned to the center of the road. The moment he stepped fully onto the asphalt, the light regained its normal strength. He felt a faint tremor in his hands, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that something inside those woods was absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He took a few slow breaths, grounding himself, reminding his body that panic would only make things worse. Yet the stillness pressing against him was unlike any quiet he had ever experienced during his years working remote routes. It wasn't emptiness, it was restraint. He felt it in the air, in the soil, even in the way the trees stood so perfectly rigid. He walked toward the footprint again, studying it more carefully. The frost at the edges hadn't melted. The imprint was so fresh that the shape remained sharp, crisp. But the weight distribution was odd. The heel was deeper than the front, suggesting the person had been leaning backward or pulling away from something. He stepped around it, scanning the gravel for any sign of additional prints. Nothing. No disturbances in the frost, no displaced rocks, no broken branches. A single footprint with no approach and no departure. It felt like a message. He turned away and started toward his truck, the lantern swinging lightly at his side. The silence followed him like a shadow. Halfway there, he realized something else had changed. The engine noise, steady and familiar seconds before, began to fluctuate. Not in volume, but in rhythm. The hum shifted in a subtle, uneven pattern, like the engine was struggling to maintain power. He felt his pulse rise again. The truck wasn't old. The engine had never given him trouble. He walked faster, holding the lantern forward as if expecting something to step into the light. He reached the truck door and pulled it open, ready to get inside, but something stopped him. The interior lights didn't turn on. The cab remained completely dark. He leaned closer and tested the dome light switch manually. Nothing. The lantern illuminated the interior just enough for him to see the keys still hanging from the ignition. He climbed halfway inside, reaching for the keys to shut off the engine, but paused when he saw something that made his breath catch. The dashboard clock was frozen. The digital numbers were stuck mid-change, with one segment of the next number faintly lit, as if the display had been interrupted while shifting from one time to the next. He shut off the truck, watching the display go black. He waited a few seconds and then restarted the engine. The headlights came on, but the dashboard remained dark. The radio flickered with a weak glow, but emitted no sound. He felt a wave of unease sink into his chest. The truck wasn't malfunctioning. Something else was interfering with it. He stepped out again and let the lantern fall to his side. The cold around him deepened. It wasn't the temperature, it was the pressure again. The same thick sensation he had felt near the exhaust pipe, but now it pressed against his entire body. He turned slowly toward the woods. The darkness between the trees had shifted. It looked layered, almost textured, like a dense curtain that had been pulled closer to the road. He forced himself to take one calm step forward, watching carefully as the lantern light reached the gravel. A faint movement caught his attention near the left side of the tree line. A shiver in the air, a ripple bending the vertical lines of the trunks. He raised the lantern higher, trying to catch the shape again. The beam trembled slightly, but the distortion didn't vanish this time. It hovered between the trees, slowly expanding and contracting, as though the space itself were breathing. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Then a sharp clicking sound echoed from the woods. A clear, deliberate sound. Click, pause, click. It repeated 3 times, evenly spaced, like a signal. He swallowed hard and instinctively looked back at the footprint. The frost around it began to crystallize further, as if a sudden drop in temperature had swept over that spot alone. He took another step back, breath tightening in his chest. The clicking stopped. A new sound replaced it, a single exhale, low and steady, coming from the tree line directly in front of him. He turned the lantern toward the sound, expecting to see eyes, a silhouette, anything. Nothing appeared, but the breath continued, long, slow, controlled. It sounded too close for comfort, yet the space remained empty. He tried calling out again, but his voice barely traveled. It felt like he was speaking into heavy cloth. The air absorbed the sound instantly. Panic slipped into his thoughts, but he pushed it aside. He took another step toward the truck, determined to get inside and leave, but the moment he moved, something scratched across the asphalt behind him. Not a shuffle, not a scuff. A clean, dragging sound, as if something sharp had been pulled deliberately across the surface. He spun around. There was nothing on the road, but the sound had been unmistakable. He realized then that whatever was watching him was no longer staying in the woods. He turned in a full circle, lantern raised high, trying to catch even the smallest hint of movement. The night pressed against him with a weight that felt unnatural. The scratch across the asphalt still echoed in his mind, too clean and too deliberate to have been caused by wind or falling branches. The air behind him pulsed with a faint vibration, subtle enough to question yet strong enough to trigger every survival instinct in his body. He stepped backward toward the truck, but froze halfway when the lantern flickered again. This time it wasn't a dimming. The light stretched, as if something ahead of him were pulling the glow toward it. He lifted the lantern, angling the beam toward the center of the road. The air distorted again, a brief ripple that ran vertically through the darkness. His chest tightened. He saw no shape, no limbs, no outline of an animal or person. But he felt it. A presence directly in front of him, standing at the edge of the lantern's reach, separated by nothing but a thin veil of darkness that refused to reveal what it held. The road behind him cracked again. He spun, expecting to catch the source. But the road was empty. The trees stood perfectly still. His breath quickened. He felt the cold push against his back, tighter this time. He turned slowly, afraid that if he moved too quickly, whatever stood in front of him would react. When he faced forward again, the distortion had grown. It was no longer a ripple, it was a solid vertical warp, stretching from the ground up to the lowest branches. The air inside it looked wrong, darker than the forest, darker than the night itself. He raised the lantern higher. The beam bent toward the distortion, warping unnaturally before being pulled inward. He staggered back, pulse hammering. He had seen fog, shadows, animals, people, but he had never seen space itself respond like that. The distortion pulsed once, an inward contraction, like a breath being drawn. A deep pressure hit his ears, muffling the world around him. His vision shook. Then something stepped forward. Not fully, not enough to show itself, just enough to break the surface of the distortion. The air bulged outward, pushing against itself as if something pressed from the other side. He tried to take another step backward, but his legs felt stiff. A sharp, metallic scent hit him. Copper, cold metal mixed with damp soil. It made his throat tighten. The distortion shifted left, then right, then stopped directly in front of him. He heard a low sound, not a growl, not a voice, a resonance that vibrated through his ribs. He felt it in his teeth. It grew in intensity, deep and steady, like something communicating without words. He stumbled back, struggling to keep the lantern steady. A sudden burst of cold air hit his face, sharp, focused, like breath. He swung the lantern toward the sensation. The distortion split open for a second, revealing a deeper darkness inside it, a cavity of black that swallowed the light without reflection. Something moved in that void. A shape, a limb, a silhouette bending in a way no human limb could bend. His breath caught in his chest. He took another step back, then another, until he felt the rear bumper of the truck press against his legs. He reached blindly for the door handle without looking away from the distortion. His fingers scraped metal. He yanked the door open. The interior lights still refused to turn on, but he didn't care. He climbed halfway inside, one foot still on the road. He kept the lantern aimed at the distortion, terrified that if he turned his back completely, something would cross the distance between them. The distortion contracted again. A long, thin shadow stretched outward from its base, sliding across the asphalt like liquid darkness. It moved toward him, steady and silent, flattening itself into a shape that didn't make sense. He lifted the lantern higher, hand shaking violently now. The shadow stopped. The distortion shifted closer. He felt the air compress around him. He didn't think. He acted. He dropped the lantern, slammed the door shut, and jammed the keys forward. The engine roared to life, dashboard lights flickering erratically as if struggling to wake. He threw the truck into gear and hit the accelerator. The tires shrieked against the asphalt. The truck lunged forward, headlights cutting violently through the road's sharp divide. Just before he turned the bend, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The distortion was gone, but something stood between the trees. A silhouette, too tall, too still, too narrow. It stood perfectly centered, watching him leave, its shape barely visible except for the faint ripple it created in the darkness behind it. He didn't slow down. He didn't breathe until he reached the main highway. He didn't remember the next few miles of road. His mind had locked itself into a single instinct: get out. The trees blurred on either side of the truck, headlights cutting a rigid tunnel through the darkness. His fingers cramped around the steering wheel, knuckles white, breath sharp and uneven. Every few seconds he checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see that distortion following him, stretching across the road like a living shadow. But the mirror reflected only the empty forest behind him, still and silent, too silent. He forced himself to keep driving, fighting the urge to look back a third time. When he finally reached the pull-off near the highway, he braked hard. The truck jolted but stayed steady. He killed the engine, letting the silence swallow him. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He leaned back in the seat, trying to calm himself, but each deep breath only reminded him of the cold air that had pressed against his face moments earlier. He reached up to wipe sweat from his forehead and froze. His hand was shaking so violently, he had to grip his wrist with his other hand, just to steady it. He sat there for several minutes before he worked up the courage to turn on the dome light. It flickered once, then steadied. Seeing the cab illuminated brought a brief moment of relief. He looked down at his jacket and noticed something smeared along the sleeve. A faint, dark streak. Not dirt, not grease. It shimmered slightly under the light. He rubbed it with his thumb, expecting the smear to feel sticky or cold, but it had no texture at all. It felt like dry fabric. But the streak remained perfectly visible. When he brought his hand closer to his face, he realized the smear had no scent, no physical trace, just a mark, impossibly present, yet not interacting with anything. His stomach twisted. He looked toward the forest again, half expecting the smear to react to its direction. Nothing happened. He stepped out of the truck cautiously, keeping one foot on the metal step in case he needed to get back inside quickly. The road ahead was empty. The forest stood completely still. No wind, no animals, not even the faint hum of insects. He heard only his own breath and the steady ticking of the cooling engine. He circled the truck, lantern in hand, shining the light along the body. No scratches, no dents, no sign of anything touching the exterior. When he reached the back, he crouched slightly, checking the exhaust pipe again. This time, warm vapor rose into the air as expected, curling upward before disappearing into the cold night. The air behind the truck felt normal. No thickness, no resistance. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He got back inside the truck and tried the radio. It crackled back to life immediately, the static normal, familiar, almost comforting. He called the main station and reported his location, but he avoided describing what happened. He didn't have the vocabulary for it. He didn't have the framework to explain what he had seen without sounding unhinged. He simply said he had encountered something strange in the forest, something that made it unsafe to continue working that night. The dispatcher must have heard the strain in his voice because she didn't argue. She told him to return to the lot and to write a report in the morning. But he didn't go back to the lot. He went straight home. He slept with the lights on. He didn't return to that stretch of road for weeks. When he finally had to, he went in broad daylight with two other workers beside him. The forest looked normal. The road was ordinary. The frost pattern on the gravel had melted and returned a dozen times since that night. Nothing seemed out of place. But when he walked to the exact spot where the footprint had appeared, he felt a familiar pressure along the back of his neck. Subtle, brief, like a breath brushing past him before dissolving into the air. He checked the ground. No footprints. No distortion. But a faint mark existed at the edge of the gravel. Not a footprint, not a drag. Something shallow carved into the frost. A single long indentation, too straight and too smooth to be natural. It looked as if something had pressed its weight there, something narrow, something deliberate. He told his crew he had to step back to the truck. He didn't finish the job that day. When people asked why he switched shifts to avoid working near the forest at night, he gave vague answers. When pressed, he only said the darkness in Dixie was different from anywhere else he had ever worked, that it behaved in ways that didn't make sense. He never again drove alone on that road after sunset. When asked if he believes it was a person out there, he shakes his head. When asked if it was an animal, he says nothing. But the one question he refuses to answer is the simplest one. What stepped into the road with him that night? He says he never saw it clearly. Only the darkness it moved through. Some people try to explain what happened on that road by blaming exhaustion or imagination. They say he must have misread shadows or mistaken temperature changes for something unnatural. But the people who knew him never believed that. He wasn't inexperienced, he wasn't frightened easily, and he wasn't the type to exaggerate a story for attention. He was a man whose life revolved around predictable routines and small, measurable tasks. Someone like that doesn't suddenly panic on a familiar road unless something extraordinary forces its way into their reality. What unsettled him most wasn't the distortion or the breath or the shifting weight of the air. It was the footprint. That single, perfect imprint in the frost with no approach, no departure, and no explanation. He mentioned it more than once, always with a tightness in his voice, as if that print represented something larger than he could understand. Something intelligent, something intentional. He believed someone or something placed it there for him to find. A warning, a test, a signal. He never figured out which. And if his story was the type that left people uneasy, the next one was the type that left people silent. Because the next account didn't come from a ranger or a road worker. It didn't come from someone trained to expect danger or someone who understood the forest's patterns. It came from a married couple who had stopped at a small cabin near the eastern edge of Dixie National Forest for a quiet weekend. They weren't thrill seekers, they weren't hikers, they weren't even particularly outdoorsy. They just wanted a short break from their routine, a chance to sit by a fire and enjoy the quiet of the woods. They rented the cabin online, a simple place tucked against a slope with a short trail leading down to a creek. Nothing unusual. Thousands of people stayed in similar cabins around Utah every year without issue. The listing mentioned no local legends, no strange wildlife, no warnings of any kind. Just a clean space with a view, a small deck, and easy access to the forest. They chose it because it was affordable and convenient, not because they expected adventure. But the person who owned the cabin had left something out of the listing. Not intentionally, perhaps. Maybe they just didn't want to scare away potential renters. Maybe they didn't believe it themselves. Or maybe they did, and simply hoped no one would stay long enough to experience what they had heard from neighbors over the years. People in that area avoided the cabin after dark, not because of ghosts or folklore. They avoided it because strange sounds were often reported near the creek. Thin, distant voices that never formed words. Heavy footsteps that didn't follow natural patterns. Flickers of movement in the trees that didn't match the wind. Almost always at night. Almost always near that specific cabin. Locals described it with restrained language, hinting that the woods behind it lived by rules that didn't apply anywhere else in the forest. The couple knew none of this when they arrived. They settled in, unpacked food, lit a small fire in the stone pit outside, and watched the sky turn from blue to pale orange as the sun dipped behind the ridge. They talked about work, life, and plans for the upcoming holidays. It was peaceful, comforting, ordinary. But sometime after the fire burned low and the air cooled around them, they heard something drifting up from the creek. Something soft, something thin. something that didn't belong to any animal they recognized. At first, they thought it might be water moving over rocks, but the sound had rhythm. This was the detail they shared the most often in their testimony. The rhythm, because nothing in nature moves with that kind of pacing. Nothing repeats itself with that level of intent. They didn't know it yet, but the peaceful weekend they had planned was about to shift into something far darker. Something that would follow them long after they left the cabin behind. Something that still keeps them awake at night, whenever they think about the moment they realized the sound from the creek was not water at all. They had been married for 6 years and spent most weekends running errands or catching up on work. Life had slipped into a predictable pattern, which was why the idea of a quiet cabin appealed to them. It wasn't meant to be an adventure. It wasn't an attempt to reconnect or rediscover anything dramatic. They simply wanted silence, space, a few nights away from traffic, deadlines, and the constant noise of city life. The cabin near the eastern edge of Dixie National Forest seemed perfect for that. Affordable, remote, and tucked against a slope overlooking a narrow creek. The listing showed photos of tall pines, a small deck with 2 chairs, and a fire pit made of stacked river stones. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. They arrived late in the afternoon. The road leading to the cabin twisted gently through the forest, weaving between thick clusters of trees before opening to a small clearing where the cabin sat. The sky was pale blue, the kind that hints at a cold night approaching. The woman commented on how crisp the air felt. The man agreed, noting he could smell the faint sweetness of pine sap drifting from the trees. They unloaded their bags, stretched their legs, and walked around the property to get a feel for the space. The cabin itself was modest. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a front deck overlooking the slope. Behind the cabin, a short trail wound down to the creek, disappearing into a darker tangle of trees. They intended to explore it the next morning, but decided to stay close that first evening. They lit a fire in the stone pit, watched the flames twist in the cold air, and talked in soft voices while the forest darkened around them. As night settled, the quiet grew heavier. They noticed it gradually. At first it felt peaceful, the kind of silence people long for in the city, but the longer they listened, the more unnatural it became. There were no insects humming, no owls calling, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The woods behind the cabin seemed to hold their breath. The man mentioned it first. He said the quiet felt too complete, like a room with all the soundproofing in place. The woman nodded, but didn't say much. She felt it too, a strange weight in the air. They tried to ignore it. They warmed their hands near the fire, cooked a simple dinner, and stepped inside for a while to get settled. When they came back out, the temperature had dropped significantly. Their breath fogged in front of them, drifting sideways in a way that didn't match the barely there breeze. The flames in the pit flickered oddly, leaning toward the slope instead of rising upward. The man frowned, moving closer to the fire. He expected to feel the heat on his face, but noticed the warmth seemed to be pulled downward, drawn in the direction of the creek. He didn't mention it at first, thinking it was just the air currents along the slope. But when he stepped back, he saw the woman looking toward the trees. She asked if he heard something. He strained his ears but heard nothing. She insisted, a sound from the creek, faint, repeating, like something tapping against stone. He moved closer to the edge of the deck and listened carefully. At first he detected nothing but the crackling fire, but then, just barely, something reached him. Thin, rhythmic, almost like a series of soft knocks spaced evenly apart. He straightened, suddenly alert. The creek wasn't far, but the water level was low this time of year. It shouldn't have been able to produce that sound. He listened again, leaning forward slightly. The tapping repeated, slow and deliberate. He glanced at the woman, and she whispered that it sounded too measured to be natural. She wasn't scared yet, just unsettled. He forced a calm expression and suggested it was probably a loose stone shifting under the current. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on the trees longer than before. As the tapping continued, he felt a faint pulse under his feet, a vibration so subtle he wasn't sure if it was physical or imagined. He walked down the steps of the deck and stood near the slope, lantern in hand. The tapping stopped the moment he moved. The The silence returned instantly, snapping into place like a lid closing over a box. The sudden stillness made his skin tighten. He took a few steps toward the beginning of the trail but stopped when the woman called his name softly. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with caution. She told him the fire had leaned again. Not flickered, leaned, as if pulled by something. He turned to look. The flames angled unnaturally toward the creek, stretching sideways as though drawn by invisible pressure. He took one step backward toward the deck. The tapping resumed. This time, it didn't sound distant. It sounded closer. He froze at the bottom of the deck steps, lantern angled toward the slope but not yet moving down it. The tapping had returned with the same slow rhythm, but the sound no longer carried the soft distance of something echoing off stone. It was sharper now, closer, more defined. Each tap struck with precision, almost like knuckles against wood rather than water against rock. The hair on his arms lifted. He looked back at the woman. She was staring toward the tree line, her expression tight, brows drawn inward with the confusion she hadn't felt earlier. He raised the lantern, letting the warm glow spread across the clearing. The fire behind them crackled weakly, its flames leaning again toward the creek as if pushed by a current of air that did not exist. He took a slow step toward the trail, waiting for the tapping to change. It didn't. It continued in the exact same pattern, the same measured spacing, the same deliberate pacing. He listened closely, trying to determine if the sound was coming from a moving source or from something fixed in place. The rhythm never shifted. That was what made it unsettling. Natural sounds changed. They wavered, fluctuated, unraveled. This rhythm remained perfectly controlled. The woman stepped closer to him and touched his arm lightly. She whispered that she didn't want him going down the trail. He said he just wanted to look. From where they stood, the trees were silhouettes, dark spines rising from the slope. The lantern's light reached the first few feet of the trail before dissolving into the thick darkness. He leaned forward slightly, trying to catch any hint of movement between the trunks. Nothing shifted, nothing swayed. The tapping kept going. He called out toward the creek, asking if anyone was down there. His voice carried into the dark but returned faintly, as if absorbed by heavy air. The tapping stopped instantly. The sudden silence hit with such force that even the woman gasped softly. He called out again, louder this time. No response, no movement, no sound of running water. The only noise came from the fire behind them, snapping once before settling again. Then the tapping started again. But this time, it had shifted positions. The sound no longer came from the creek. It came from the tree line on their left, near the cabin's rear corner. A new rhythm, same pacing, same strength, but closer, much closer. The couple turned simultaneously, eyes drawn to the shadows behind the cabin, where the lantern's light only brushed the edges. The tapping continued, steady as heartbeat, as if something were walking its fingers along the wood of the trees. The man felt a tightening in his chest. He swung the lantern toward the sound. The light hit the side of the cabin, then drifted toward the trees. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then he saw it. The faintest movement in the darkness. Not a shape, not a figure. Just the subtle shift of shadow. A ripple in the blackness that moved horizontally between the trunks. The woman grabbed his sleeve. He didn't speak. Neither of them did. The tapping stopped for the second time. A thin noise replaced it, a dragging sound, something sliding lightly across bark. The sound circled the back of the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if something were tracing the outline of the structure from the rear corner. The man stepped back instinctively. The lantern flickered. The fire behind them leaned again, this time bending so sharply toward the slope that the flames nearly stretched flat. The dragging sound stopped near the far corner of the cabin. The couple held their breath. For a moment, all they heard was the faint hiss of cooling embers from the fire pit. Then, soft and controlled, something tapped against the cabin's exterior wall. One single knock, perfectly measured. They both turned toward the sound. The tapping repeated once, then again. Each knock landed exactly the same, as if produced by something with deliberate coordination. The man swallowed hard and took a step toward the cabin, lantern shaking slightly in his hand. As he moved, the tapping ceased, replaced by a single sound coming from the trees again. A breath. Long, slow, heavy. Not wind, not animal. A breath shaped by something alive. The woman whispered his name, voice barely recognizable from the tension gripping it. She pointed toward the tree line. He lifted the lantern and caught something he couldn't explain. Two trees stood side by side, trunks thick and straight, but the darkness between them wasn't empty. It shifted, bending inward, almost as though the space itself had mass. A faint glimmer ran through that darkness, like reflected light sliding along a curved surface. He blinked, trying to sharpen the image, but the shape pulled itself deeper between the trunks until only empty black remained. He stepped back toward the deck without turning his back fully. The tapping did not return, but something else did. A low clicking sound from the slope, closer to the creek, but rising swiftly up the hill, as if climbing with precision. It didn't sound like it was searching. It sounded like it had found where they were standing. The clicking rose steadily from the slope, each sound sharper than the last, climbing the hill in a perfect line. The man stepped backward onto the deck, lantern raised, feeling the boards flex under his weight. The woman followed him without being asked, her eyes fixed on the trail where the sound had begun. The clicking reached the top of the hill and stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so sudden it felt like the air itself had locked into place. They waited, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. The man leaned slightly forward, squinting into the trees, trying to see beyond the reach of the lantern. The forest stared back at him with a flat, unmoving darkness that held no depth. It felt like staring into a wall rather than into woods. The tapping, the dragging, the breath, the shifting shape between the trunks. Every moment gathered in his mind and settled into a single conclusion. Something was watching them from the slope. The woman whispered that they should go inside. Her voice was thin, tight. He agreed instantly. They backed toward the cabin door, but before they reached it, the fire behind them let out a sharp crack. Not the natural pop of burning wood. This was louder, cleaner, like the sound of something snapping under sudden pressure. They both spun toward the pit. The flames twisted violently, bending almost horizontal, as if pulled by a force sweeping across the clearing. The air around the fire darkened, the flicker of the flames swallowed by something just beyond the lantern's reach. A second crack echoed from the slope. Then another. The clicking returned, not rising this time, but circling the clearing. The sound moved with mechanical precision, each click evenly spaced. The man raised the lantern higher, scanning the ground for movement. The light reached the edge of the slope, and he saw something that made his breath hitch. The frost on the ground, barely visible in the lantern's glow, had shifted. A line of fresh indentations traced a perfect semicircle around the clearing, following the hill's curve. Not footprints, not animal tracks. These were narrow depressions, long and straight, as if something thin had pressed into the ground in a rhythmic sequence. The marks were fresh, newly formed. They hadn't been there minutes earlier. The clicking moved again, closer now, following the line of indentations as though whatever made them was continuing its path behind the cover of darkness. The woman pressed closer to the cabin door, whispering that they needed to go inside immediately. He grabbed the handle and pushed the door open, urging her in first. She stepped inside quickly, turning to face him. He was about to follow when the clicking stopped once more. A new sound rose from the slope, soft at first, almost like breathing, but then it shifted. The breath lengthened, deepened, and turned into a slow pull of air that sounded too controlled, too steady. He felt the pressure of it against his chest, an invisible force pushing at him from the trees. He stepped backward into the cabin, still facing the clearing. Just as he did, the lantern dimmed again. The glow thinned, flickering once before narrowing into a sharp cone of light. He lifted it higher, shaking it slightly, but the light refused to brighten. Instead, the darkness beyond the deck seemed to lean inward, as though something was moving closer, compressing the air around them. Then, between two trees at the crest of the slope, he saw motion. Not a figure, not an animal. A shift, like the outline of the trunks bending inwards as something slipped between them. The space distorted, pulling the lantern light sideways. He felt the breath on his face again, colder this time, as though it were inches away. He stepped fully inside the cabin and shut the door. The woman locked it instantly. The lantern flickered in his hand, struggling to maintain its glow. They stood silently in the darkness of the room, listening to the forest outside. The clicking started again. This time, it came from directly behind the cabin's exterior wall. And it wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting. The clicking crept along the back wall with mechanical precision, each sound evenly spaced, as if whatever produced it were tracing the outline of the cabin. The couple stood frozen in the dark living room, the lantern's glow trembling across the wooden floor. The man raised it slowly, angling the beam toward the nearest window, but the light bounced back at him with a muted haze. The glass reflected the room too clearly. He couldn't see outside. It was as if the night had pressed against the window so tightly that nothing beyond the glass existed. The woman whispered that they should move away from the wall. He agreed without speaking and guided her toward the center of the room. The floorboards creaked softly under their feet, the sound unnervingly loud compared to the silence outside. When they stopped moving, the clicking stopped too. They held their breath, waiting, listening. For a moment, the cabin returned to stillness. Then the sound shifted locations. A faint drag scraped along the far corner of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like a fingertip pulling across rough wood. The woman flinched. The man tightened his grip on the lantern, pointing it toward the source. The dragging traveled upward, as if climbing the cabin exterior. They listened, the noise moving along the height of the wall, then disappearing entirely near the roofline. A new sound replaced it. A soft pressure, the faintest groan of wood under weight. Something was on the roof. The man's heartbeat thudded so hard, he felt it in his throat. He tried to swallow, but his mouth had gone dry. He motioned for the woman to stay still. Above them, tiny vibrations trickled through the ceiling, irregular at first, then suddenly precise. The weight shifted, then again. Something paced across the shingles, slow steps pressing down with unnerving clarity. The man counted. 4 steps, then silence, then 2 more. The thing moved with intention, stopping directly above them. The lantern flickered violently, dropping to half its strength. The shadows around the room stretched in unnatural patterns, pulling toward the center of the floor. The air grew colder. The woman grabbed his arm, nails digging into his sleeve, whispering that they needed to hide. But the man couldn't move. He listened, waiting for the next sound. It came from the roof again, a sharp crack followed by another. The shingles groaned under shifting weight. Something heavy repositioned itself. The sound traveled toward the edge of the cabin, then halted. The man took a small step backward, pulling the woman with him. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He didn't want to say it out loud. Something slid down the side of the cabin. Not fast, not clumsy, smooth, controlled. A glide instead of a fall. The scraping continued until it reached the window nearest them. The lantern's dim light flickered across the glass as they stared, both holding their breath. A shadow passed behind the window. Not on the glass, behind it, between the trees and the cabin wall. It moved too quickly to define, but the darkness shifted unmistakably, like a tall shape crossing from left to right, with fluid precision. The woman clamped a hand over her mouth. The man stepped back again, lantern trembling. Something tapped lightly on the glass, one tap, perfectly spaced, then another, then a third. Slow, deliberate, measured. The exact rhythm they'd heard by the creak. He aimed the lantern at the window. The glow barely pierced the reflection. No face, no form. But the tapping responded, each knock harder than the last. The third knock cracked the glass slightly. He jumped back, gripping the woman's arm as she stumbled behind him. The tapping stopped abruptly. The dragging sound moved again, traveling along the wall, slipping behind the cabin toward the back door. The man's heart hammered as he realized the path it was taking. The clicking resumed, each sound perfectly timed, approaching the far corner of the house. Then everything stopped. Silence swallowed the cabin so thoroughly that the man could hear his own pulse echo through his ears. He took a slow breath and whispered that they needed to get into the bedroom, the only room with no exterior windows. The woman nodded quickly. They moved toward the hallway. Halfway there, something pressed against the front door. Not a slam, not a hit, a slow pressure. Wood bowed inward, creaking under weight. The hinge bolts whined. The man grabbed the woman and pulled her toward the bedroom faster. Another groan rolled through the doorframe, deeper this time. Something outside pushed harder, testing the structure. The lantern flickered again, struggling to stay lit. They reached the bedroom and shut the door. The woman locked it instantly, then helped the man push a dresser against the frame. The lantern cast weak light across the walls, the shadows stretching and contracting like they were breathing. The cabin trembled faintly, wood fibers shifting under stress. From the living room, something exhaled, a long, heavy breath that filled the space outside the bedroom door. The man held his own breath. The woman did the same. Then came the sound that broke him. A slow handprint formed on the other side of the bedroom door. Long fingers, too long, pressing inward, not knocking, not scratching, reaching. And then everything went silent again. They stood frozen, staring at the door as the imprint slowly faded. The wood regained its shape, but the memory of those long fingers remained burned into their minds. The man gripped the lantern so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. The woman clung to his sleeve, holding her breath, as if any sound might draw the thing closer. The silence in the cabin deepened, a suffocating quiet that pressed against their eardrums. The man leaned forward slightly, listening for movement on the other side of the door. Nothing. No dragging, no tapping, no clicks. The quiet wasn't comforting, it was calculated. The same stillness they had felt earlier by the fire. Something was waiting. Something was listening. He motioned for the woman to stay quiet. She nodded, though her eyes were wide with panic. A faint shift in the air reached them, not a sound, a change in pressure, as if something large had moved away from the bedroom door without disturbing the floorboards. The man tightened his grip on the lantern and forced himself to step closer to the door. He placed his ear near the wood, ignoring the memory of the long fingers that had appeared moments earlier. All he heard was silence, stretching outward like a void. He whispered that they needed to leave the cabin. The woman shook her head violently, but he insisted. Staying meant waiting for whatever was outside to make the next move. Leaving meant choosing their own moment. He checked the lantern. It flickered weakly, but remained lit. That had to be enough. He unlocked the bedroom door slowly, each click sounding impossibly loud in the silence. He pulled the door open an inch, then two. The living room stood empty. No movement, no shadow shifting. Only the faint smell of cold air drifting through the cabin. The tapping at the window had stopped. The dragging along the walls had ceased. The distorted darkness between the trees was nowhere in sight. For a moment he wondered if the thing had left entirely, sliding back into the woods. But something about the silence told him that wasn't true. He stepped into the living room, pulling the woman behind him, lantern first. The cabin felt drained, as if the structure had lost all warmth. Every corner held a thin layer of cold that didn't match the temperature outside. The fire pit still glowed faintly through the window, but the flames no longer leaned toward the creek. They barely moved at all. When they reached the front door, he pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. He unlocked the deadbolt with shaking fingers. The woman grabbed his arm, whispering that she didn't think they should open it. He whispered back that something had been able to reach the bedroom door. Staying inside wasn't safer. He opened the door slowly. The night outside was unnaturally still. The trees stood perfectly rigid, as if carved from stone. The frost along the ground caught the lantern light in sharp, crystalline patterns. The air hung heavy, pressing down on their shoulders. The man stepped onto the front deck, scanning the clearing. No distortion, no shadow, no movement. But the frost held a detail that made his stomach twist. Something had passed through the clearing. Long, narrow depressions cut across the frost in 3 separate arcs, tracing a wide semicircle around the cabin. Each indentation was perfectly spaced, as if placed intentionally. The marks led toward the slope, stopping at the point where the forest thickened. Beyond that, the ground looked untouched, but he felt certain the thing had not vanished. It had simply stepped into deeper darkness. The woman tugged on his sleeve, urging him to move. They left the cabin quickly, walking down the trail toward their car parked near the base of the slope. The clicking did not return. The breath did not return. The dragging did not return. The woods watched them instead, heavy and silent. When they reached the car, the man unlocked it and helped her inside. He turned the key, expecting the engine to resist. It started immediately. The headlights hit the trail. The beams stretched into the trees, illuminating nothing but trunks and frost. He pulled onto the narrow road leading away from the cabin, refusing to look in the side mirrors for more than a second at a time. Halfway down the road, the woman told him not to slow down. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. He drove until the forest thinned and the sky opened above them. Only then did he stop the car to breathe. They reported nothing. They wrote no reviews. They told the owner only that they had left early due to an emergency. They tried to forget. But the silence behind that cabin stayed with them, especially the rhythmic tapping that had followed them from the creek to the walls. Months later, the man woke in the middle of the night to a sound coming from the hallway of their home. 3 taps, evenly spaced, measured. He got out of bed and checked. Nothing. No one. No shadow, no movement. But when he returned to the bedroom, he noticed a thin layer of frost on the inside of the window. Just one small patch, only on his side of the room. A long, narrow indentation curved through it. He wiped it away. It reformed the next morning. He never went back to Dixie National Forest, but whatever had followed them out of those trees had already learned the rhythm of their home, and it had not forgotten them. Dixie National Forest is the kind of place people picture when they imagine quiet weekends, beautiful trails, and star-filled skies. On the surface, it looks harmless, even peaceful. But the people who've spent nights deep inside those woods know the truth behind the stillness. They know the quiet there doesn't behave like normal quiet. They know the darkness doesn't settle the way darkness should. They know the forest watches. 3 stories from different corners of the same landscape. A trained ranger who felt the air shift around him as something moved through the trees without leaving tracks. A road worker who watched space distort in front of his own truck and heard footsteps that left a single impossible print. A couple who listened to a rhythm that wasn't water, wasn't wind, and wasn't human until it followed them home. Different people, different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. But the patterns are the same. The silence that drops too quickly. The cold that presses instead of chills, the movements that don't match wind or wildlife, the strange marks left in frost or bark or soil, the sense that something intelligent moves through those woods in ways that don't follow rules of nature or physics. You can talk to locals who've lived near Dixie their entire lives. They'll tell you the forest has places no one visits after sunset. Not because of superstition, but because they trust their instincts more than explanations. They'll tell you about the areas where the air feels wrong, where animals avoid walking, where sound travels strangely and never echoes back. They don't describe creatures or legends, they describe absence, a presence defined by what it takes away rather than what it reveals. Authorities don't officially label these places. They don't mark them on maps. Missing persons reports get filed, but the details rarely match up. Search teams find odd disturbances in the soil or trees, but no signs of predators or human threats. Equipment malfunctions get dismissed. Strange noises get attributed to wildlife. And the stories get buried under paperwork and silence. But the forest doesn't forget. People who've experienced it firsthand never talk about what they saw with confidence. They talk about what they felt, the pressure behind their shoulders, the breath that didn't belong, the way the darkness seemed to move in one direction while the trees remained still. They remember the moments where something watched them without showing itself. They remember how the air seemed to shift as though space itself were pulling inward. They remember the way the silence settled like a closing door, and no matter how far they drive afterward, no matter how quickly they leave the forest behind, something stays with them. The ranger who transferred out of the region, the road worker who refused to go back after dusk, the couple who heard 3 taps inside their own home months later. None of them can explain what they encountered because none of them saw it directly. Dixie doesn't give answers, it only gives signs. And those signs never appear twice in the same way. If you ever drive through the forest at night, pay attention to the air around you. If it thickens suddenly, if sound drops too quickly, If the darkness ahead looks heavier than it should, don't ignore it. Those who survive encounters in Dixie always say the same thing. The forest warns you before it shows you anything. It gives you one small sign, a footprint with no approach, a knock without a hand, a breath without a body, a distortion in the trees. And if you feel that shift, even for a second, do not stop to investigate, do not call out, do not wait for a second sign. Because in those woods, whatever moves in the silence is never far. And it always waits for the moment you realize you are not alone. If you made it this far, stay aware, stay cautious. And remember that places like Dixie don't need legends. They create them one person at a time, and the forest is never finished looking for the next one who steps too far into its quiet.